Welcome to Pick Up and Deliver, the podcast where I pick up my audio recorder when I drop the kids off at school and deliver an episode to you while I walk home. I'm Brendan Riley. Alright, good morning listeners. It is Wednesday, May 30th, and it's kind of a gloomy day in here in Chicago today. It feels like it's going to rain sometime soon, so I'm glad to be out getting my exercise before that happens. Well, today I am coming at you with the last of my episodes about my top 50 games. This is going to be numbers 10 through 1, my 10 favorite games as of the end of 2017. I like to revise that list occasionally. I'm going to try to do it yearly from now on. But honestly, I don't know. I've played a number of games this year that could very well have made it into my top 50. I really enjoyed them. So it'll be interesting to see where we are this time next year. Whether those games have stayed attractive to me or whether they've drifted off a bit. Either way, today I'm going to talk about my top 10. This episode may run a little longer than usual because these are 10 games I really like and I want to give them each their due diligence. Although, because they're my favorite games, you've heard me talk about them quite a bit. So I will moderate my approach or try to think of something different to say about them, so that if you're a loyal listener who's been listening for all 53 episodes up to this point, that you aren't stuck listening to me just saying the same things over and over again. So my number 10 game is from Czech Games Edition. Game designer Vladimir Suchy, or I always said it Suchi, but I've heard it said Suchy recently by people who seem like they would know, and that is Last Will. I've mentioned this game before a number of times. Last Will is an excellent game for the not quite enough feeling, where you really want to do something, you just don't have quite enough resources to do it, particularly actions. Those are the most limited part of Last Will. You get a certain number of actions based on which position you take, but you also get a number of other things that allow you get turn order, actions, and number of cards that you get, and those things determine what you can do and what you can succeed at. If you haven't played before, the idea is that your rich uncle has died and left you a lot of money, but his condition was that he wants to enjoy the money. So you only get the whole pot of money if you spend a certain amount of it by the deadline. And that, so it's basically Brewster's Millions as a board game. It's rendered in late Victorian era, late Victorian era. So it's hansom cabs and butlers and stuff, no cars. There's horses, and so it's sort of like British aristocracy or British upper middle class spending all their money as quickly as they can. It's a really goofy game, but super fun, super thinky, lots of depth. I recently got the Getting Sacked expansion, which means you have a job that you have to get fired from, or else it keeps giving you money when you're trying to spend your money. And so that part is fun as well. And there's some variability that the game comes with when you have that expansion. So Last Will, my number 10 from Vladimir Suchy and Czech Games Edition. Number 9 is the third major tentpole game from Flying Frog Productions. The other two games I've mentioned both made my top 50. That was Last Night on Earth and Fortune and Glory. I don't have as Aliens from Outer Space, and I don't think I'm going to get it. But the other three all have the same visual aesthetic of made-up photographs, staged photographs, rather than drawn art. And they all have this similar play styles in that they involve running around, rolling dice, picking up items, and they're very sort of Ameritrashy in that way. A Touch of Evil is my favorite of these because I really like the theme. It takes place in colonial era America, and you represent supernatural investigators trying to find and destroy the villain of the episode. And the game comes with like 4 different villains, and each villain has their own set of minions that will appear on the board. And there are 2 big box expansions, both of which have more villains in them, and then there's other villains as well that you can print offline. So there's something like a dozen villains or something like that, which make for really amusing gameplay. It's also really evocative settings, and in the expansions they tweak the rules a little bit to make the roll and move a little less onerous. If you roll a 2, you're not totally boned. Ultimately, it's a pretty silly dice chucker, but it's fun. It's a long game though, so I generally wouldn't recommend it unless you have the time set aside. But A Touch of Evil, the supernatural game, one of my favorites. That's my number 9. Number 8 is perhaps the most heavily referenced game in this podcast, and that's the David Turksey game from Mind Clash. That's Anachrony. I've talked about this ad nauseum throughout the run of the podcast, so I won't spend too much time on it now. Suffice to say, it's a worker placement game that involves a time travel element that's kind of like Alone, but not quite. It's got specialized worker placement, which just turns out is something I think is really snazzy. It's got these nifty miniatures if you have the Exosuit Commander pack, which I think add a lot of flavor to the game and give it a lovely table presence. It occurs to me that if I get my painting skills back into order, that painting those miniatures would be really fun. So that may be something I'll do soon. But I highly recommend Anachrony as a deep, brain-burning worker placement game. And you can listen to practically any other episode of this podcast to learn more about that one. So that's my number 8, Anachrony. So if I've mentioned Anachrony all those times, what could possibly be better? Well, first off, my number 7 is Arkham Horror, the card game. Arkham Horror is an entrancing card game involving exploring and investigating supernatural occurrences in the Arkham universe generated by Fantasy Flight. Now, I love this game. I really, really like it, and I've been collecting it, but I hardly ever play it. In part because I really would like to play it with my wife, and it just hasn't worked out to play it with her. So actually this summer I'm thinking I'm going to start one of the campaigns solo, or I've talked about doing it online with a friend over Skype, but every time I sort of mention it, he's like, yeah, let's do it, and then we don't actually plan it. So if I want to get the game played, I may have to just do it myself. But it's a really interesting game of deck building where you're creating your character and exploring challenges, and then you're trying to solve these puzzles by going to places and outwitting monsters and solving mysteries, and it's really interesting. An excellent game. It's a bit of a money hog because it's one of the Fantasy Flight's living card games, meaning that in order to keep up with it, you have to keep buying new material, which is particularly silly if you aren't playing it, but no one ever said I wasn't silly. Really evocative, really interesting, it's also co-op. I don't think I mentioned that. So if you are looking for an experience where you're working with somebody rather than against them, Arkham Horror, the card game, might be right up your alley. And that's my number 7 from Fantasy Flight Games. Number 6 is the highest rated... Oh, it's not. Number 6 is another Martin Wallace game. If you hadn't guessed, I enjoy his games. This is perhaps his most famous game, and it's Brass. Now, I have the older version from Eagle Griffin with the ugly cover, and oh, how much I like the look of the new one, but I haven't yet decided I'm going to spend the money to buy it. Maybe what I'll do is wait till all those Kickstarters come out and then start watching for people who are dumping them because they don't like it, and I'll pick it up used or something. Because I really like the look of the game. And he made a sequel called Brass Manchester, which changes the game a bit. Apparently has slightly different rules, but also feels more open. Brass Lancashire, which is the retitle of the original game, is a very tight game. You're constantly struggling to figure out what you can possibly do on your turn, and it's really delicious in that just not enough feeling that I enjoy so much. So that's Brass Lancashire, my number 6 from Martin Wallace. Number 5 is another game I've talked about. In fact, I did my Message from the Deep episode a couple weeks ago on this, and that is Star Wars Rebellion. So as I talked about in that episode, Star Wars Rebellion is a 2-player game in which one player is the Rebel Alliance, and the other player represents the Galactic Empire, and your goal is to either bring down the Empire or destroy the Alliance. There's all sorts of machinations to pursue in the game. There's interesting card play, there's nuance, there's bluffing, there's some Ameritrashy dice rolling. It's a lovely game, and I really enjoy it. So it's a bit of an epic game, though. It takes up a lot of room on your table. What's something I can say about it that I haven't said before? Yeah, I think I mentioned this, but if you are a Star Wars fan, this is the closest thing you get to actually getting to play the movies. By playing this game, you feel like you're running the movie on the galactic scale. You send your leaders to do actions that feel very real. You know, you send Obi-Wan in to sabotage something, and then Darth Vader captures him, and then you can do a noble sacrifice. Or you send Princess Leia in to do something, and then she gets captured and put on ice, or she gets turned by the Emperor, and then now she's a villain working against you. Which isn't something that happened in the movies, but feels like it fits the narrative pretty well. There's the swaying of the alliance of the allegiance of different planets, and it's just a delightful game, really interesting. It's very long. It's like 4 to 5 hours to play, so it's not a game entered lightly, but for all that, it's really enjoyable. So that's Star Wars Rebellion, my number 5 from Fantasy Flight Games. Lead designer on that is Corey Konecka, somebody I actually have several of his games, or games that he's a co-designer on. He seems to be one of the lead designers for Fantasy Flight. Number 4 is Dungeon Petz. So this is from acclaimed and one of my favorite designers, Vlada Shavato, for Czech Games Edition, as always. And Dungeon Petz is a very thematic worker placement game where you are raising pets to sell to dungeon lords. You remember the Dungeon Lords game I mentioned a while back? It actually is in the same universe. It's got the same art style. It would be a really fun 1-2 punch to play the two games together, and it would have been neat if Shavato had released rules that allow you to play both together. Like somehow you have a dungeon lord, and then you're able to raise a pet and sell it to the dungeon lord in one of the Dungeon Lords games, in the Dungeon Lord game. That would have been a neat twist. But even without that, the overall move of the game where you're raising these monsters is really pretty satisfying. The rules all feel integrated. There's a mix of luck and skill. I really like it. So Dungeon Petz is my number 4. It's cute, it's fun, it's thinky, it's difficult, and it's great. So number 3, my top 3. I bet if you've listened to this podcast before, you know what they are. I bet my number 3 is harder to predict than my numbers 1 and 2. But my number 3 game that I, at least currently, is Pandemic Legacy Season 1. Now, I mentioned Pandemic also made my top 50 quite a while ago. But Pandemic Legacy is a whole different beast. And I think the Legacy game, the idea of the Legacy game, is the most exciting thing to happen in board gaming in who knows how long. Now, I admit there are some people who have what I feel is a reasonably justified beef with the Legacy system, in that the games run out. That when you play a Legacy game, there's a limit to how many times you can play it. With Pandemic Legacy, if you're really good at it, you can play 12 times. If you are not good at it at all, you can play 24 times. But those are the limits. And once you've done that, then you've exhausted Pandemic Legacy, and there's nothing else to do in the game. I suppose you could replay it on the last level, the last game of it, over and over again if you wanted. But I don't think that would be fun. So the playthrough of Pandemic Legacy Season 1 is an experience in itself. But like with the Legacy model, the idea of a game where the game story elements are opened up to you as you play is really provocative, because this is the thing that's been missing from games for so long. Jeff Engelstein mentioned this actually in a flashback ludology episode that I just listened to this morning, about the idea that in games the mechanisms are visible, and so it's hard to ascribe narrative to things we know are random. If you play a video game and a character is mean to you, you don't know what in the game made them be mean to you. So as a player, you build the idea of narrative into that experience. By contrast, when you play a video game and something happens and you roll a chart and you realize that you got a 4, so the character's mean to you. If you'd rolled a 3, they would have been nice. If you rolled a 1, they would have given you a treasure. Well, then you know it's a random die roll rather than a narrative choice by the game designer, and it doesn't feel the same. It doesn't feel like story, it feels like mechanism or random chance. So legacy components give to us the feeling of that narrative element that otherwise game mechanics don't allow for. And that's part of what makes Pandemic Legacy work so well. It of course, the changing board, the fact that the game is already familiar, works really well, right? If you're going to do Pandemic Legacy, you already know how to play Pandemic, probably, and the experience of playing it is much more satisfying than it would be if you're playing a game you're not familiar with, right? Which is the complaint many people had of Seafall, which is that as much as the legacy elements were interesting, they just didn't really like the game of Seafall, the actual sailing your ship around and exploring things and building up your ship or whatever, the things you do in Seafall to make your ship better. People just didn't like that as much. And so then the narrative did not, for a lot of people, overwhelm it. I thought Seafall was great. It was in my top 50. I really like it, but there are people, many who don't. So if you haven't played Pandemic Legacy yet, you'll notice I'm not really saying much about the plot of the game. Of course, you know it's about diseases spreading around the world, but it is really a narrative experience, and the delight of the game is playing through and discovering the narrative beats, the things that happen in the game. So then when you're talking to somebody, you can say, oh, do you remember what happened in this month? And like, oh my gosh, that was such a surprise or such a dramatic moment. So exciting. Well, so the other two things about a legacy game that are really exciting are you get to destroy things. So often in a legacy game it says, destroy this card, which is fun. There is something fun about ripping up a card. And then there's another part of it that says that will have you put stickers on the board or name things. Like whenever you get a new character, you get to name them and they become part of your squad of characters you can choose from at the beginning of the game. And that part is really satisfying as well, to have these named characters who participate in the adventure. It's really fun. You get to know them and like them, and then when they get hurt or killed, which is something that can happen, it's all the more satisfying. So, strongly recommended, my number 3 game, Pandemic Legacy Season 1. I have trouble thinking how long this will hold on, because as it goes along, it becomes memory rather than recent plays. Although some of these games, like I said, I've only played once or twice, so they're already memory. But because Pandemic Legacy Season 1 is a fixed game, it's hard to figure out how to put it on here, but that's where it is for me. So 2 left. I don't know if you caught my mumbling a few minutes ago when I was talking about Brass, my number 6 game. I started to say the highest rated Martin Wallace game in my top 50, but it turns out it's not. The highest rated Martin Wallace game in my top 50 is A Study in Emerald. Now, Study in Emerald is a game I've talked about almost as much as Anachrony. There are a few games in my collection that get as much attention as A Study in Emerald. Nonetheless, here I am talking about it. So A Study in Emerald is it's not a worker placement, it's an area control game that's card driven, like a lot of Martin Wallace's recent area control games. I would say it's a sort of side branch of the family of games that include Lincoln and A Few Acres of Snow and Mythotopia and A Handful of Stars. These are all games that involve playing cards to marshal resources and then use those to capture or move around area spaces on the board. And A Study in Emerald fits that model pretty well. However, it's also got a whole bunch of other stuff going on. It's got all these complicated rules. It is super weird. I've said before that I feel like the complications in the rules are there to be intentionally maddening, like the game itself is maddening. Because the theme of the game, of course, is madness. And so, theme, I've talked about this a little bit, but again, this is my number 2 game of all time. I think we can take another minute for it. So, A Study in Emerald is based on a Neil Gaiman's short story of the same title, which is an adaptation of a Sherlock Holmes short story called A Study in Scarlet. So the Sherlock Holmes story is about the murder of a Bohemian prince and the political ramifications of that murder, in which Holmes is trying to investigate the murder of this prince, and it turns out to be a political plot and so on. So Neil Gaiman's story, A Study in Emerald, is based on that Sherlock Holmes story loosely, but turns it on its head, and I will let you read it to discover what. But basically the idea is that the elder gods of the Cthulhu mythos have come to life and are the elder gods of the Cthulhu mythos had invaded Earth a long time ago, and they took over the royal houses of Europe, and so the royalty of Europe was no longer human, but was in fact these elder gods. And there are factions of humans who want to depose the elder gods and return the human rule to the world. So in the game, you're divided into one of 2 factions. You're a loyalist or you're a restorationist. If you're a loyalist, you're loyal to the elder gods. If you're a restorationist, you want to destroy them. And then you recruit to your side all these famous historical anarchists as well as fictional characters. So you get the characters from Sherlock Holmes, like Irene Adler or Dr. Moriarty or Dr. Watson. But you can also get like Leon Czolgosz, the guy who shot McKinley, or Emma Goldman, like these famous real-life anarchists, to join your cause and perhaps commit some bombings or whatever. Then the idea is you're competing for points. And the end condition of the game is really interesting in that you, at the end of the game, the player with the least points, everybody reveals their team, and the player who has the least points, their entire team loses. So unless they're all on that team, in which case then the winner is the person with the most points on that team. But if there's even one person on the other team, that person wins. So there's a really interesting dynamic where you're trying to figure out which team the other players are on, because you want to help the people on your team so that your team is not in last place. But you still want to win. So it's a weird dynamic, but fun and interesting. The board is bonkers. The gameplay is weird. There's all these edge cases. Now keep in mind, I've not played the 2nd edition, which apparently smooths things out a bit. Takes away some of the edge cases or the bonkers rules. I like it the way it is, so I'm not driven to seek it out. But it's delightful and enjoyable and weird, and I wish I could play it more often. In fact, I should. So that's my number 2 game from Tree Frog Games, designer Martin Wallace, A Study in Emerald, 1st edition. Finally, my number 1 game. I already mentioned it once here as a side. I sometimes do an entire different podcast about this game. It's a lifestyle game, a living card game you collect and play over years. It's Android Netrunner. So Android Netrunner is a card game where you play a hacker or a corporation. And a hacker, called a runner, is trying to break into the corporation and find out what they've got going on. So you do runs on their servers to steal their information. And if you find their agendas, which is like their plans, then you get points. And if you find 7 points worth of agendas, you win the game. On the corporation side, you're trying to defend your servers from the runner through either tricky servers that make it too expensive for them to get in, or perhaps some traps that will kill them through net damage, like frying their brain, or through meat damage, like you find out where they live and send a squad of goons to their apartment. But the idea is while you're making it hard for them to find your agendas, you're actually putting them out and advancing them, which is an action you have to take. And once you advance them enough, then they score and they get you points from 1 to... There's one agenda that's worth 6 points in the game, but most of them are worth usually 2 or 3 points. And you're also trying to score 7 points. So the idea of the game is that you want to score 7 points, whichever side you're on. As the runner, you score it by finding and stealing those agendas. As the corporation, you score it by advancing them and scoring them that way. So it's an endlessly fascinating game with tons of variety. I would say the best way to learn more about it would be to check out my other podcast, which hasn't put out an episode in months, but I will again, called Install from Heap, which is available on the Rattlebox Games podcast feed or at all your fine podcast retailers. So, what did you think of my top 10? Drop by Boardgame Geek Guild 3269 and let me know what you think. What games are in your top 10? What do you have to say about the games I picked? Have you played them? Which is your favorite? Which would you like to play most? If we run into each other at a con or you come to Dirty Nelly's some Tuesday, which of these 10 games would you most want to play with me? Let me know in the comments under this podcast page, or better yet on Boardgame Geek Guild 3269. You can reach out on Twitter at rattleboxgames or by email brendan@rattleboxgames.com. All of those things will find their way to me with varying degrees of speed and success. Well, I'm just about done with my walk. I appreciate you letting me take a little bit longer here. This is basically a double episode, but it was my top 10 games, and I wanted to spend a little time on them. Thanks for joining me for these last 54 episodes, and here's hoping you'll stick around for the next bunch. This kind of represents the beginning of my summer, so I may slow down a little bit in the podcasting. We'll have to see. If the podcast goes away for a while, worry not. Leave me in your feed. I'll definitely be back in the fall, even if I stop for a couple weeks here in the summer, or even a couple months. So, do reach out on Boardgame Geek or in other ways to let me know what you think. Otherwise, I will talk to you next time that I talk to you. And until then, I hope that your next walk is as pleasant as mine was. Thanks for listening. I really appreciate it. Bye-bye.
Brought to you by Rattlebox Games.